A Great Argead Saga Alexein, Alexander the Great. Volume 1, Telesias, The War Dance. By Macedonia. A new episode every single day. Episode 19, Golden Larnax. The night over Argead was not dark. It was a bruised, shimmering tapestry of orange and ash. The pyre, a towering, skeletal grid of timber, had become a furnace that defied the cool mountain air, turning the necropolis into a distorted, hellish theater. While the fire devoured Alexander II, the Macedonian camp remained in a state of suspended, agonizing breath. Outside the perimeter, the Illyrian fires flickered like predatory eyes, but for once, the night was quiet. It was the silence of a held blade. As the night deepened, the three factions remained locked in a tactical stalemate, all centered around the pyre. The pyre continued to roar, a beacon of destruction. It was the only thing preventing a civil war, and every crackle of wood was a second of time stolen from a kingdom on the brink of liquidation. No one spoke, no one slept. They simply watched the flames, each side calculating exactly how much blood would be required to win when the sun rose over a field of ash. Ptolemy did not sleep. He sat hunched over a heavy oak table, his fingers tracing the seals of grain shipments and mercenary ledgers. Every time a log snapped within the pyre, he flinched, his hand darting to the hilt of his sword. If the army riots now, he thought, staring at the wax seals, I am a dead man. The fire is the only thing keeping them from the arena. He wasn't worrying about the past, he was worrying about the morning. His plan was simple but terrifying. Keep the troops' eyes fixed on the spectacle of the funeral games. If he could hold the facade of stability until the sun reached its zenith, he could claim the regency with a bloodless transition. But if the Illyrians attacked before the games concluded, or if the barons realized his coffers were as hollow as a shell, he would be buried beneath his pyre alongside the dead king. He had guards stationed at every tent flap, not to protect the camp, but to prevent the officers from whispering to one another. The night was a stifling shroud. The pyre had reached its zenith, a roaring, cyclopean eye of white and gold that turned the surrounding landscape into a theater of shifting, monstrous silhouettes. Inside the central royal tent, the air was stagnant, heavy with the cloying scent of burning myrrh and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Eurydice, the first queen, sat upon a low stool with her spine, a line of tempered steel, motionless as a tomb effigy. Across from her, Princess Eurynos stared into a polished bronze basin, her hands shaking so violently, she had to clench them into her lap, burying her knuckles to suppress the restless jangle of her jewelry. Do not pace, Euryno, Eurydice commanded, her voice a serrated whisper that seemed to carve the air. The guards outside are listening for the rhythm of our breathing. If they hear agitation, they will report it to the regent's spies. We are mourning, not plotting. Remember that. Euryno looked up, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. They are mocking us, mother. I can hear the mercenaries outside. They whisper of the end of the Argead line. They don't even lower their voices anymore. Eurydice did not look at her daughter. She kept her gaze fixed on the entrance flap, where the flickering orange light from the pyre cast long undulating shadows that danced like trapped spirits. Let them whisper. Wolves only howl when they are hungry and afraid. As long as they are focused on the funeral, they are not focused on the treasury. We have time, barely. Outside, in the biting chill of the Macedonian night, Philip and Perdiccas paced the perimeter of the royal enclosure. Their hands were tucked deep into their cloaks, but their eyes were constantly moving, tracking the darkness beyond the camp with the predatory alertness of animals in a snare. The Illyrians, Perdiccas whispered, his voice cracking. He kept glancing toward the northern ridges, where the pine trees were merely jagged ink blots against the stars. Bartolus is out there. Do you think he'll wait for the pyre to go cold, or will he strike while the camp is distracted? Philip stopped walking and stared into the gloom. He didn't answer immediately. He was listening, not to the soldiers, but to the silence between the gusts of wind, waiting for the telltale shift in the mountain air. He's waiting, Philip said, his voice flat. If he strikes now, he hits a wall of iron. Parmenian's phalanx is too dense, and the regent's guards are too terrified of failing to be anything but lethal. But when the pyre collapses, that is when the structure of this camp breaks. That is when the Illyrian moves. Perdiccas shivered, pulling his cloak tighter. The generals, they look like they've barely slept. Parmenian is half dead on his feet, leaning on his pike. If a real assault happens, will they even be able to form the line? They will, Philip said, his eyes hard, because their own lives depend on it. Ptolemy has the perimeter flooded with his hand-picked men. Security isn't low, it's suffocating. They are watching us just as much as they are watching the ridge. Philip looked at his younger brother, his expression softening for a fleeting heartbeat before hardening into stone once more. Don't look for the Illyrians, Perdiccas. Look at the guards. See how their eyes are always on us, never on the trees. That is the real danger. We are surrounded by men who are waiting for a signal to see if they should guard us or bind us. They resumed their walk, two shadows moving among giants, keeping their heads bowed as if in prayer, while their minds mapped every exit, every gap in the phalanx, and every pulse of the dying fire. The night over Argead was a suffocating pressure, the pyre a white-hot sun that refused to set, casting the entire necropolis into a distorted, hellish theater, where the final act of the Argead dynasty was being written in ash. The shadows at the edge of the pyre were not merely occupied by the mourners, they were infested. Looming at the periphery were the Lyncestians and the Elymiots, the extractors. These lords of the highlands and the peripheral provinces had arrived under the guise of paying their respects, but their true purpose was to salvage whatever power could be ripped from the cooling corpse of the Argead line. While the phalanx block stood rigid, these highland lords leaned casually against the granite slabs of the necropolis. Their eyes were not on the cleansing flames, but on the treasury wagons and the administrative scribes huddled near the perimeter, calculating the spoils of a crumbling state. The Lyncestian Duke, Aripus, stood with his hands tucked deep into his embroidered sleeves, a thin, jagged smile playing on his lips. Let the regent play his games of legitimacy, he thought, watching Ptolemy's nervous, erratic pacing. The boy king's death is a windfall. Every shred of authority the regent fails to anchor today is a province I'll extract tomorrow. We have been vassals for long enough, it is time we became the creditors. The Elymiot chieftains were less subtle, standing in a tight, bristling knot with their hands hovering near the hilts of their curved mountain blades. As the masters of the kingdom's silver mines, they held the true pulse of the economy. Ptolemy wants the army, one chieftain murmured to his brother, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the pyre. Let him have the iron. We hold the coin. Without the silver from our hills, his loyal mercenaries will desert him before the first watch of the next moon. Argead stood at the threshold of the pyre's radiant fury, her presence as unyielding as the mountain stone. She had walked this path before. 2 years ago it had been her husband, King Amyntas III, whose bones were consigned to the embers. The weight of that previous grief had hollowed her out, leaving only a core of absolute tempered iron. Her face was a mask of sculpted calm, yet her eyes, sharp, predatory, and restless, tracked the movement of every guard, every glint of spear tip, and every shift in the soldier's stance. Behind her, her 3 sons, Archelaus, Argead, and Menelaus, stood like sentinels, their young frames silhouetted against the roaring orange maw of the inferno. Watching the Lyncestian lords from the corner of her eye, Argead felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her chest. She had seen the way they moved, not like mourners, but like wolves sniffing a carcass. Do you see them? She whispered, nodding almost imperceptibly toward the Lyncestian camp. The extractors, Archelaus breathed, his jaw tightening. They aren't here for the funeral. They're waiting for the power to fracture so they can peel away their provinces. They want to be kings of their own dirt, mother. They are more dangerous than the Illyrians, Argead replied, her voice sharp as glass. Bartolus wants our blood, but the Lyncestians want our state. They are here to strip the carcass of this kingdom of every jewel, every contract, and every title. If we do not make our move before they finish their tallying, there will be no kingdom left to claim. She turned her gaze back to the inferno, her memories superimposed over the flames. She remembered the heat of Amyntas's funeral, the way the world had seemed to tilt then, too. She was a veteran of dynastic collapses. She knew the scent of a falling throne better than anyone. Watch the phalanx, boys, Argead whispered, her voice a low, melodic tremor that cut through the thunderous crackle of burning cedar. Parmenion is tightening the perimeter. Do not mistake it for a gesture of loyalty. He's not doing it to protect the house. He's doing it to control the space. When the fire burns down and the light fails, the center of this valley will belong to whoever holds the ground, not whoever claims the title. Archelaus, the eldest, kept his gaze locked on the northern ridge, where the pines loomed like jagged, dark teeth. Through the swirling smoke, he caught the faint, rhythmic glimmer of bronze armor shifting in the pines. His breath hitched. They aren't just waiting for the funeral to end, he realized, a cold dread pooling in his stomach. They're waiting for the fire to die. They are the scavengers, and we are the meat. Menelaus, Gygia murmured, her hand reaching back to grip her youngest son's forearm, her fingers digging into his tunic with frantic, desperate strength. Listen to me. If the Illyrians charge the moment the pyre collapses, do not, under any circumstances, run for the royal tent. The tent is a tomb waiting to be sealed. You run for the cavalry lines. Find the commanders who still remember the taste of our salt, the ones loyal to the blood, not the promise of Ptolemy's gold. The three brothers nodded in unison, their faces washed in the violent, transformative glare of the blaze. The heat was blistering, singing their skin and turning their throats to ash, but the fire outside was nothing compared to the one burning within them. This is not a conclusion, Archelaus thought, his heart hammering against his ribs like a captive bird. This is a countdown. He looked at his mother and saw the jagged edges of a woman who had already accepted that their world was ending. She was the widow of a king, the mother of pretenders, and the survivor of a kingdom that seemed perpetually intent on devouring its own. Every pop of burning wood sounded like a footstep on the stairs of their own execution. Survival is a game of position, Gygia added, her voice barely a breath. If they come for us, we do not stand and die for a name. We carve our way to the horses. We are not just princes tonight, my sons, we are the prey. And the only way to outlive the hunt is to realize that the hunter is already within our gates. The boys stood straighter, their shadows elongating into something monstrous and powerful against the stone. They understood the grim arithmetic of their existence. The throne was not a prize to be inherited, but a furnace to be survived. As the pyre cast its final, reaching tongues of light into the dark, they waited, silent, alert, and ready to shed their childhoods in the coming bloodbath. Beyond the royal circle, the architects of the coming collapse stood in the flickering light, their minds miles away from the dead king. Parmenion stood at the head of the phalanx, his eyes bloodshot, leaning heavily on his pike. He was half asleep, yet his mind remained a cold, grinding engine. The line is holding, he thought, but it is a brittle thing. He didn't care about the Illyrians. He cared about the interval between his own men and the foreign mercenaries. He was simply waiting for the moment the regent forced an order that would break the cohesion of the army. When that happened, his pike would not point toward the enemy, but toward the new master. Old Italus stood near the pyre, his broadsword hilt glowing in the searing heat. His veterans were a wall of silent, crusted bronze, motionless as statues. He wasn't guarding the king anymore. He was guarding a grudge that had festered for a lifetime. Ptolemy trembles like a girl, Italus mused, his hand white-knuckled on his sword hilt. He thinks this fire hides his weakness. He doesn't realize he's turned this entire camp into a tinderbox, and I am the spark. Antipater sat in the absolute shadows of a supply tent, his back turned firmly against the funeral rites. His fingers traced the edge of a sealed scroll hidden within his mantle, the true treasury of Macedonia. Let them play at soldiers, he thought, his eyes devoid of any emotion. By dawn, the coin will be gone, the mercenaries will be aimless, and the Argead legacy will be a hollow house. I have already liquidated the throne. They are simply fighting over the ashes. Young Italus moved through the peripheral tents like a fever, his presence a jagged pulse of adrenaline. He was whispering to the hot-blooded young nobles, pressing a whetstone into their palms with the intensity of a zealot. Ptolemy has the veterans, but I have the hunger, he thought, his eyes glittering with a predatory fever. When the pyre breaks, the riot won't be a tragedy, it will be a purge. I'll make sure the arena isn't a place for games, but a place for a new king to be born in blood. As the pyre roared, casting long, grotesque shadows across the ancient tombs, the men who held the kingdom's fate in their hands watched the flames. They weren't looking at the dead. They were looking at each other, waiting for the first man to blink, knowing that when the wood finally turned to ash, the silence would be broken by the clash of steel. Across the road, Ismenias and his men sat in their harbor formation, their armor catching the infernal orange light. They were the only ones who weren't worried. They were the apex predators of the situation. Burn, Ismenias thought, watching the embers rise into the dark. Burn until there is nothing left. The more they tremble, the easier they will be to shatter. He had no interest in harassment. Harassment was for small men. He was waiting for the moment the Macedonian order fractured, the moment Ptolemy's authority evaporated along with the wood of the pyre. He had his men ready to march not into a battle, but into a vacuum. High on the northern ridge, Bartolus did not sit. He did not pace. He stood perfectly still, his heavy, scarred frame draped in furs that smelled of resin and high-altitude ice. To the Illyrian juggernaut, the burning pyre below was not a funeral, it was a beacon, and he was the moth waiting to consume the flame. The Illyrian vigil was a study in predatory patience. While the Macedonian camp below remained a chaotic storm of frayed nerves and whispered betrayals, the heights were silent. Bartolus had arranged his archers and light infantry in a jagged semicircle, their positions concealed by small, shielded heat pits that allowed them to stave off the biting mountain air without casting a single flicker of light into the valley. Bartolus watched the pyre's intensity with the eyes of a master builder. He knew the structural limits of pine and cedar better than any Macedonian architect. He watched the way the smoke twisted, the path of the ghost, as the mountain tribes called it. He wasn't watching the corpse, he was watching the rate of the collapse, measuring the life of the fire against the ticking of the night. The regent is desperate, Bartolus mused, his hand resting on the pommel of his massive iron blade. He is trying to buy stability with fire. But he doesn't understand that a fire that burns this bright creates a vacuum. It draws the air out of the valley, and soon it will draw the sanity out of his men. He issued his commands in low guttural tones that barely carried across the mountain terrace. His orders were absolute: no torches, no fire, and no sound. His men ate cold, dried meat and drank snow melt, motionless as the stones they crouched behind. Any man who rattled a quiver was struck once, hard, and without a word. They were to remain invisible, a dark, silent gravity pulling at the Macedonian perimeter. Bartolus was not planning a standard charge. He was waiting for the dead horde bruised, gray moment just before the first light of dawn. When the human spirit is at its lowest end, the frantic adrenaline of the funeral would have soured into the bone-deep exhaustion of the vigil. As he watched the pyre reach its roaring peak, Bartolus felt the heavy, vibrating thrum of the flames even at this distance. If I attack now, I fight a unified wall, he thought, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the Macedonian phalanxes below. But if I wait? He saw the way the phalanx blocks were shifting, the way the mercenaries were beginning to grumble, and the way the royal family was hemmed in by their own panicked guards. Ptolemy is squeezing the life out of his own camp. He thinks he is strengthening the perimeter, but he is only packing them tighter for the slaughter. Bartolus traced the line of his scarred jaw with a thumb. Let them continue their sacred rites. Let them weep over the bones. When the pyre collapses and the heat finally dies, the cold will hit them like a physical blow. That is when I will break the fence. I will not just win a battle, I will harvest this dynasty before the embers are even cold. He turned his back on the valley, trusting his lieutenants to hold the line, and walked to his own private fire pit. He took a single swallow of sour, fermented honey wine, his eyes never straying from the valley below. The juggernaut was ready. He was simply waiting for the moment when the Argead house would finally realize they had no floor left to stand upon. The dawn light, thin and sickly, began to bleed over the mountains, but the pyre remained a defiant, pulsating heart of orange in the gray valley. It was nearing its end. The massive timber grid had slumped into a glowing, chaotic ruin, the cedar and resin now hissing as they surrendered to the final consumption. Ptolemy stood at the edge of the heat shimmer, his face drawn, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with the exhaustion of a man who had not blinked for 10 hours. He watched the white-hot core of the fire, where the last recognizable shape of the king, or what was left of him, was dissolving into shimmering ash. He had performed the ritual. He had stood as the shepherd of the morning camp. The throne was effectively his. Turning his back on the embers, Ptolemy walked toward his command tent, his boots dragging in the cooling dust. He felt a phantom weight on his shoulders, a chill that the morning air could not explain. He pushed through the heavy felt flaps and stepped into the dim, stagnant interior of his tent. He stopped dead. Sitting at his desk, perfectly still, was Alexander II. The king was not charred, he was not broken. He was vibrant, his skin glowing with the vitality of a man who had never seen a blade. He wore his royal regalia, polished to a mere sheen, and an enigmatic, terrifying smile played upon his youthful lips. In his hand, he casually turned a dagger, the same blade Ptolemy had seen in the chaos of the night before. "You really thought it was that easy, Ptolemy?" Alexander's voice was smooth, a melodic, chilling whisper. "You thought you could purge the court by cutting off the head? I've been waiting for you to make this list. You were always the first name." Ptolemy's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He tried to scream, to call the guards, but his throat was dry, paralyzed by a primal, soul-deep terror. "You are dead. I saw you fall. You think I killed you? Killed me?" Alexander tilted his head, the smile never wavering. "You thank me, don't you? Thank you for the death that saved my life, and thank you for the life that cost you yours. But look at you. You were the one who held the reins. You were the one who stood by. You killed yourself, Ptolemy, in the moment you decided to watch me fall. And now the entire army thinks you are the one who struck the blow. You are the architect of your own undoing. And now you want to know why I haunt you?" The king's smile widened, stretching too far, until the skin began to tear at the corners of his mouth. The transformation was instantaneous and violent. The vibrant, youthful mask dissolved. Alexander's skin began to bubble, blistering into a scorched, blackened hide. The smell hit Ptolemy, the sickening, sweet, and metallic stench of roasted meat and wet, melting cartilage. Alexander's eyes, milky and sightless, pushed forward, bulging from their sockets as the heat of the pyre consumed him from within. The lower jaw hung loose, disconnected from the skull, and from that gaping, incinerated void, a sound emerged, not a voice, but the wet, rattling wheeze of a corpse laughing. Ptolemy lunged backward, his heel catching on the edge of the rug. He hit the ground, gasping, his hands clawing at the dirt floor of his tent. He sat bolt upright, his chest heaving, sweat pouring down his face in cold, icy rivulets. The tent was silent, illuminated by the pale, honest light of the rising sun. There was no king, no scorched ghost, only the distant, rhythmic clatter of soldiers beginning their morning watch. Ptolemy wiped a trembling hand across his forehead, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering sobs. The phantom smell of burning flesh still clung to the air, thicker than the morning dew. He looked at his hands, they were shaking, and he realized with a jolt of pure, unadulterated dread that he couldn't stop them. He was not just a regent anymore. He was a man haunted by a king who had turned his own death into a trap, and Ptolemy was the only one caught inside it. The grueling night stretched across more than 10 hours of agonizing transformation before the dawn finally broke in profound, heavy silence. As the cold, razor-thin light of morning cut through the eastern peaks of the Pierian range, the monstrous flames that had pierced the sky all night finally receded, looking like dying, bloated beasts. The hundreds of great timber logs collapsed inward with a low, heavy sigh, settling into a vast, pulsing mountain of smoldering charcoal and white ash. Those freezing, infinite hours required for the human body to be consumed by the ferocious thermal mass, and for the remaining bones to settle into a state fit for collection, acted as a silent crucible, grinding away at the souls of the living. It was an eerie, suspended reality, where time was measured only by the changing scent of burning flesh and the steady, rhythmic clicking of cooling metal armor. Eurydice stood rigid, her lips chapped and cracked from the blistering heat waves that had assaulted her face for half a day, refusing to yield an inch of ground. Flickering behind her eyelids, stubborn and agonizing, was the memory of the smooth, unblemished warmth of Alexander's skin when he had uttered his very first cry inside her womb. Now, that cherished flesh had been ravenously devoured, reduced to stark, chalky skeletal remains. A lethal mixture of a mother's curse toward the usurper and the suffocating despair of failing to preserve her firstborn stained her vision deep crimson. She felt the phantom weight of her late husband Amyntas's ghost, watching from the adjacent tumulus, a silent accusation vibrating in the soles of her feet. For Perdiccas, however, these 10 hours had been an unadulterated descent into hell. Inside the persistent crackle of the collapsing wood, he could not stop his mind from hearing the phantom, suffocating shrieks of his brother's final moments. It was a rhythmic, scratching noise that crawled inside his skull. Beneath his heavy wool cloak, his palms slipped repeatedly against the sweat-slicked bronze hilt of his ceremonial sword, his fingers cramping from the tension. He wondered if his turn was next. The fire that had parsed his brother's flesh to dust stood ready to incinerate him at a moment's notice. Under the weight of that absolute terror, the 17-year-old's resolve was fracturing, his sanity hanging by a single, frayed thread. Ptolemy of Elorus, the new regent, stood with crossed arms, watching their internal unraveling with the cold, calculative gaze of a butcher inspecting livestock. For him, the 10 hours had been a dark theater where the sweetness of his triumph could crystallize. They are broken, Ptolemy thought, though his fingers twitched against his elbows, betraying the rigidity of his posture. I have ushered the Argead line to its end without spilling a drop of my own wine. Am the architect of a new order. Yet, as the fire died, the intoxicating certainty of the night began to sour into a creeping acidic paranoia. Ptolemy's gaze darted toward the tree line, then snapped back to the phalanx. Every rustle of the wind sounded like a blade being drawn from a scabbard. Every shadow in the peripheral vision of the guards looked like the ghost of the boy he had just sent to the pyre. Who is waiting? He thought, his skin prickling. The Lancestians are silent. Antipater is too quiet. Any one of them could be waiting for the smoke to fully clear to send a steel message of their own. He caught the flash of a blade in the distance and flinched, his hand flying to his own dagger. It was only a soldier adjusting his gear, but Ptolemy's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. The ghosts of the Argead seemed to crowd the air around him. He felt as though Alexander's unblinking, youthful eyes were watching from the very center of the embers, waiting for him to lower his guard for a single, fleeting second. He wasn't the man to gloat. He was the man who knew how easily a throne could be toppled by a single, well-placed knife in the dark. The spirit is hot, and the hero wanders. The chief priest's voice boomed into the mist-laden morning sky, but to Philip's sharp ears, the performance rang hollow. The holy man's eyes were bloodshot, his throat hoarse from the all-night, rhythmic liturgy, yet it was a manufactured exhaustion. He was shouting like a theatrical actor performing for an audience of wolves, his eyes darting subtly toward Ptolemy's tent to ensure the regent was witnessing his pious dedication. His voice was cracked, stripped of human melody, but it carried the unctuous, practiced cadence of a man who traded in divine favors for a royal coin. Bring forth the vintage. The priest screamed, his hands raised to the sky, trembling with a feigned, ecstatic fervor. Quench the thirst of the late king and cool his bones. Ptolemy stiffened, his eyes scanning the crowd of generals. He didn't see mourners. He saw men calculating the exact depth of his grave. Every shout, every cheer for the dead king felt like a signal for his own assassination. He was the most powerful man in Macedonia, and as he stared at the cooling, gray ruins of the pyre, he had never felt more like a man walking toward a waiting blade. A column of heavy hoplites, swaying with an absolute bone-deep exhaustion, marched forward in a mechanical cadence. Their armor was black with soot, their muscles trembling under the weight as they tilted the massive ceramic amphorae resting on their bruised shoulders. Unwatered, thick Macedonian red wine, dark, dense, and syrupy as coagulated blood, was unleashed en masse onto the white-hot core of the timber, dousing the skeletal remains of Alexander. The ritual of gathering cremated remains, the oscillage, or the turning of the beneswis, a sacred, highly intimate act in the Argead tradition. It was a final, agonizing labor of love, a service of honor that fell solely upon the immediate family. To handle the remains was to touch the physical essence of the king. It was a duty of Ptolemy that only those bound by blood could perform without risking miasma, that dangerous ritual pollution that followed the dead. A violent atmospheric exploded into the clearing, a sound so deafening and immense it felt like the final, agonizing breath of a dying titan. A colossal, violent wall of boiling white steam erupted upward, a blinding curtain of vapor that instantaneously wiped out all visibility, swallowing the sun, the calculating generals, and the ancient tombs. The world vanished into a blinding, scalding fog. The suffocating, sour perfume of scorched honey, rancid bull fat, and blackened, caramelized grapes saturated the morning air, thick enough to coat the lungs and leave a heavy, sugary rot on the tongue. The nauseating taste of a sanctified political murder. It sounds as if brother is releasing his very last breath, Perdiccas whispered. His face was a horrific mask, disfigured by layers of gray soot and the tracks of dried tears. His hands trembled with a violent, rhythmic frequency against the base of the Larnax, the metal clicking against his signet ring. A minute. desperate sound marking the absolute breaking point of the boy's psychological endurance. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drop the urn and run blindly into the mist, away from the ghost of his brother. "No," Eurydice hissed. Her voice dropped into a freezing, venomous whisper directly against her son's ear, her fingers sinking into the meat of his shoulder, like claws to tether him to the earth. Her gaze remained locked onto the thermal ruins of the ash heap, unmoving through the blinding steam. "This is the sound of the earth reclaiming its own seed. Burn that sound into your eardrums, my children, for that is the exact sound a crown makes when it cools. Learn what cold iron sounds like. It does not sing, it chokes." Philip stood a step behind them, his face still caked with the dried, blackening crust of the stallion's blood from the day before. As the steam hissed and boiled against his skin, he didn't hear a dying brother, and he didn't hear a mother's grief. His mind, operating with the terrifying, sterile precision of an architect, analyzed the sound. "The heat is gone," he thought, his slate-gray eyes piercing through the white vapor. "The theater is over. Now comes the calculation." He looked at the white mist thinning around Ptolemy's silhouette across the pit. The world had gone cold, and in the cold, only those with the sharpest teeth could survive. As the heavy mist gradually thinned, drifting away in ghostly tatters to reveal the black, sodden heap of charcoal, the priests gestured with their blood-smeared knives. It was time for the next of kin to enter the perimeter, step into the dying heat, and fulfill the final duty, to bathe the bones in wine and oil and gather the burning white fragments of bone from the ash into the golden Larnax. Philip and Perdiccas stepped forward into the ring. The soles of their thick leather sandals instantly sizzled and blackened against the scorched stone floor, shooting an uncomfortable, searing heat up their legs. Yet, 14-year-old Philip did not alter his expression by a single fraction. He dropped to his knees and, without a shred of hesitation, plunged his bare hands into the gray sediment. His fingertips made contact with a fragment of the femur, bleached white and stripped clean of flesh by the extreme heat. The bone was shockingly light, yet it still radiated the deep residual warmth of his brother's departed life, a strange, lingering heartbeat vibrating against his skin. He handled it with the cold, reverent focus of a man performing a surgery, rinsing the fragment in the silver basin of wine and oil provided by the priest before placing it, with agonizing gentleness, into the golden chest. He was no longer a boy, he was the vessel of the Argead legacy, sifting through the embers of the old order to see what could be salvaged for the new. Across the ash, Ptolemy stood watching, a faint, predatory smirk twisting his heavy lips as the dawn mercilessly illuminated his usurping features. "I am the one who orchestrated the ending," the arrogant glare of the man communicated, his posture radiating a smug, heavy malice. "I pushed the stone that crushed the Argead legacy. And now, wretched little prince, you kneel in the morning light, sifting through the ruins at my feet to gather his bones." Such is the ledger of the defeated. Yet, even as he projected this mantle of absolute triumph, the reality beneath the armor was rapidly fraying. Ptolemy did not kill Alexander. He had simply been the one to step into the power vacuum the instant the king fell. He was a creature of opportunity, not a regicide, and that distinction was beginning to feel like a death sentence. "I didn't strike the blow," he thought, his stomach churning with a cold, liquid dread. "But the gods and the court will act as if I did. They will look at this pyre and see a ladder, and they will want to climb it by stepping over my neck." As the light grew bolder, revealing the bloodshot, calculating eyes of the generals watching him, Ptolemy's confidence cracked. He realized with a jolt of pure terror that he had become the most visible target in the kingdom. Any of them, Parmenion, old Attalus, even the silent, shadow-dwelling Antipater, could decide that the shortest path to the throne was not through the boy king, but through the regent. Who is next? He wondered, his gaze darting to the shifting ranks of the guards. If they could take him, what is to stop them from taking me? I'm not a king. I'm a placeholder. And placeholders are designed to be removed. The silence of the dawn, usually a comfort, now felt like the held breath of a predator before a strike. He adjusted his cloak, his hand brushing the dagger at his belt, but it felt insufficient, a toy against the sea of daggers that seemed to point his way from every tent, every phalanx block, and every dark corner of the camp. "I didn't kill him," he whispered to himself, a frantic internal prayer against the encroaching paranoia. "But someone is going to kill me for it." Philip refused to look at the faces of the surrounding generals. Antipater stood like an ancient stone guard, his face expressionless, but his eyes tracking Philip's every movement with a quiet, unsettling intensity. Attalus stood nearby, subtly shifting his weight, his eyes lingering on the heavy gold ornaments of the burial gear, already calculating how to turn the morning's grief into military leverage. Their hollow sympathy and their treasonous, shifting eyes held no geometric value to Philip now. He simply stared straight back into Ptolemy, driving his 14-year-old slate-gray gaze directly into the usurper's retinas with an unnatural, chilling stillness. Then, without blinking once, he submerged his brother's white bone fragments into a golden bowl filled with olive oil and dark wine, cleansing them one by one. The liquid swirled, turning a pale, murky pink. With every fragment that sank through the liquid hitting the bottom with a soft, hollow clink, the circuitry of vengeance carved into Philip's core hardened into something as cold and unyielding as tempered bronze. One day, Philip thought, his eyes tracking the long, distorted shadow his own body cast across the bleeding stones. Ptolemy, it will not be wine that extinguishes your fire. It will be my shadow, falling directly across your epitaph. The chief priest solemnly presented the Larnax, a heavy, rectangular chest of beaten gold. Its lid was embossed with the 16-rayed Argead star, the son of Regina, which glinted like a sharp, judging eye in the cold morning light. The fragments of white bone, purified by the fire, were laid out with terrifying reverence onto a square of royal purple linen. "The king is gathered," the priest declared, his voice cutting through the damp fog to bring the rite to its close. In that instant, Ptolemy stepped forward, his heavy shadow swallowing the chest. He seized the golden lid and slammed it down. Clang! The metallic collision echoed against the limestone walls, a heavy, final sound that hit the mourners like the blow of a hammer. To Ptolemy, it didn't feel like a door locking. It felt like a shield snapping into place. He rested his calloused palm flat against the golden star, his breath hitching. He wasn't savoring a conquest. He was trying to ground his own shaking nerves. Secure, he thought, the word echoing frantically in his mind. It is secure. As long as the bones are contained, the chaos is contained. Eurydice stood erect at the edge of the pit, an iron spear driven into the earth. She watched him, her gaze piercing the sweat that slicked his forehead. The safest hands, Ptolemy, are often the ones that grip so tightly they crush what they hold, she warned, her voice a freezing weight in the morning air. Take care that you do not accidentally strangle the very kingdom you claim to protect. The dead have a way of loosening an iron grip. Ptolemy let out a low, ragged laugh, not the sound of a victor, but of a man desperately trying to convince himself of his own strength. He didn't believe in phantoms, but as he looked at Eurydice, he felt a sudden, irrational terror that the king's ghost was standing right behind her, waiting for him to blink. He felt exposed, as if the entire camp were a ring of judges waiting for him to stumble. A kingdom requires a firm hand to be governed. Queen Mother, Ptolemy replied, his voice slipping into a practiced, sharp cadence to hide the tremble in his hands. And my grip is steady enough. He turned his face toward the perimeter, his eyes darting toward the massive stadium beyond the necropolis walls. He wasn't looking at the soldiers with pride, he was looking for threats. Every block of massed spears seemed to be shifting, a rhythmic, predatory movement. Are they turning? He wondered, his heart hammering. Is the next one to fall going to be me? He gestured toward the stadium, where thousands of soldiers stood in terrifying, silent formation. He needed them occupied. He needed the violence to be directed outward, away from his own throat. My army has endured a long vigil, Ptolemy said, his voice straining for authority. They are hungry, and the uncertainty of the night has made them volatile. They demand the games. They demand the spectacle to be witnessed by the new King Perdiccas. Let us begin the slaughter. Let them pour their restlessness into the sand, and let the gods see that this transition is absolute. He stepped back from the Larnax, his gaze sweeping the camp one last time, searching for the assassin he was certain was already moving toward him. Keep them busy, he told himself, his mind a whirlwind of survival. Keep them busy, or the pyre that took the king will soon be built for me. To be continued in Episode 20, Geometry of Sacrificial Flesh. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Telesias playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 1. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 5 to 15-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our Vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.